put together this briefing on migration because as the EPP Group in the European Parliament, we have been trying to consistently put this issue of migration on the agenda of the European Parliament and the European Union as a whole, because we have been warning for months now that we are sleepwalking into a new crisis. If you look at the numbers, just to paint the context, in 2022, we've had 330,000 people illegally crossing our borders. This is the highest number since 2016 and an increase of 64% compared to last year. Also, for the first time since 2015, 2016, we've seen over 100,000 asylum applications per month in the EU for 3 consecutive months in September, October and November already. Those are the most recent numbers. And this building up and clustering of unusually high levels of asylum applications signals also the mounting pressures that we have on our national systems. More than 600,000 asylum applications are pending at the moment in the European Union, and we see member states reaching or even far overstepping the limits of their capacities for reception and procedures. The recognition rate in the European Union is less than 40%, indicating that almost 2/3 of asylum applicants are not actually in need of international protection. We see high numbers also for applicants from countries like Morocco, Bangladesh, and Georgia. And at the same time, the return rate remains alarmingly low. Around 20% of those told to return to their country of origin actually does. And this is unsustainable and it needs to be urgently addressed. Now, the EPP is not alone in these concerns about migration. We've had the publication of the latest Eurobarometer in January, and it turns out that 70% of European citizens is worried about the impact of migration on their lives and the lives of those close to them. 70. That was a voice from beyond. So sorry, 70% of Europeans are concerned about migration. 7 out of 10 Europeans are concerned about this, and their concerns must be addressed at the European level. So it's good that the Swedish presidency under the EPP leadership has made this a priority. We saw all the competent ministers of the member states of Europe last week in Sweden, and we're also looking forward to the special European Council next week. And I say we're looking forward, but we're also somewhat concerned. Just as an example from my own country, our Prime Minister Mark Rutte last week indicated in an interview that he had dozed off in the past years when it comes to migration. Dozing off, even though there are plenty of warning signs. Today, the Dutch government announced that the Netherlands received the highest number of asylum requests since 2015 in the last year, all while leaders were dozing off. So it is time to wake up. The European Council of February needs to be a summit of less words, more action. Europeans are fed up with never-ending discussions and they look to Europe to provide answers. And from the EPP Group in the European Parliament, we will present our updated position on migration. And we need to have a European policy that consists of strong protection of our external borders, with screening at the border to distinguish between refugees and economic migrants. Effective return of those who are not in need of international protection, and a truly European approach on the basis of solidarity. We need a system that gives us the instrument to stand up against despicable behavior of countries like Turkey and Belarus, who are instrumentalizing vulnerable people for their own political games. And we need to step up cooperation with third countries in the areas of migration management, returns, the fight against smuggling gangs, and the root causes of migration. And this position paper that we will adopt this Wednesday in our group meeting should also be seen as an urgent call to the leaders of Europe to be bold and decisive next week. And we have many issues that we have included in our paper because we need to have a holistic approach to migration. But 5 issues I would like to repeat today that we will also address during the plenary debate this week. First of all, adopt the Migration Pact. We need a clear commitment from European leaders that the Pact on Migration in all its aspects will be adopted before the next European elections, which are taking place next year. Like I said, migration is an issue of concern of 70% of Europeans, and it has been more or less so since the refugee crisis in 2015. And we cannot show up at the next European elections empty-handed on migration. Again, we as a group are ready and committed to conclude all files, and we count on the Council and on all other parliamentary groups in this House to make that same commitment. Secondly, less talk about protecting borders, but actually protecting borders. Making European funding available for those countries that are protecting our external borders to do so in the way they deem most effective and practical. That too is solidarity. And for too long, the idea of European funding for physical border infrastructure such as fences has been a taboo in the Berlaymont, and this is no longer sustainable. We need leadership on this as well. Third, we need to finally step up on return. From Timmermans and Mogherini in 2015 to Borrell and Johansson today, we hear a lot about intensifying our cooperation with third countries, but we don't see much actually happening. There is no strategy in place at the Commission, it seems, to make this work. We are still not speaking as a European Union with one voice, and neither the Council nor the Commission seem to make real efforts to change this. We need to use all the instruments at our disposal, trade agreements, visa policies, development aid, legal migration, etc., in order to ensure sufficient cooperation from third countries. They have a responsibility as well to take back their nationals, and we can no longer allow 4 out of 5 illegal migrants to simply remain on our territory despite all our procedures, rules and regulations. It will only come at the expense of the public support for the protection of those that really need our help. Fourth, put forward a code of conduct for NGOs. We call on the Commission to put forward a code of conduct for civil society organizations participating in search and rescue activities. It can never be a sustainable solution to leave it to NGOs to patrol the maritime borders of Europe. We need a clear policy and a clear rule book defined by the EU to avoid loss of life at sea and to ensure a humanitarian approach while discouraging human smuggling and trafficking networks. And fifth, resume the discussion about regional disembarkation platforms, also on the southern side of the Mediterranean, where asylum seekers can be received safely and their claims can be assessed in an efficient, dignified and humane way. The automatism that paying a criminal gang for a seat on an unseaworthy vessel for a dangerous journey that will always automatically result in access to European territory, whether you are a refugee or not, this needs to end. It only favors the multi-billion-dollar smuggling industry and those migrants that are not in need of international protection. The European Council flagged this idea already in 2018, but nothing has happened since. It is high time to revive this idea as well. Now, these are 5 areas that on our behalf, in our opinion, we need immediate action from the Commission and the European Council, and the upcoming summit is going to be a key moment to push for solutions in the field of migration. So far, however, on the basis of the draft Council conclusions that are floating around, President Michel is not exactly planning to meet such expectations. So we remind him today, and we'll remind him again in the plenary debate here in Brussels on Wednesday, that the time for talk is really over and that we need and we expect actions from our European leaders.
So my question is about the issue number 2, about the funding of most European countries. Last week, the President Ursula von der Leyen wrote in her letter to the European leaders, to the leaders of the member states, that the Bulgarian-Turkish border must be a priority. At the same time, the European Commission does not want to fund this fence or wall. It depends how they call it. What's your opinion? Who must fund this fence or wall? I don't know.
Yeah, but like I said, the idea of European funding for physical infrastructure at the external borders, whether they are fences or walls or whatever, has been and is still some sort of a taboo in the Berlaymont. And I think it's unfair for Commission President von der Leyen to say that defending the external border between Bulgaria and Turkey is a priority for the European Union, but nobody in the European Union wants to take responsibility for that protection. I think it's unfair also when you look at it from the context of solidarity, that we would have to leave it fully up to Bulgaria to protect a border that is the border of the whole European Union. So I would expect from the Commission and from President von der Leyen that if she feels that it is a priority, which I share with her, a priority to defend the external borders of the European Union, to protect them, then it is also a duty and a responsibility of the European Union as a whole to help those countries do that in a way that they deem most effective. And if this is the case for physical border infrastructure, then there needs to be European funding available to do so.
I was wondering if you're on the same page with your German colleague Manfred Weber.
Always.
Always, okay. I make it a bit clear with his proposition about the externalization of migration to establish European offices, for example, in Tunisia, and check the asylum request there. Is it from your whole part? Is it from the EPP, this demand, or is it just?
Yes, like I said also in my introduction, I think it's important that we revive the discussion about this idea. It was launched in the form of regional disembarkation platforms in 2018 by the Council, but there was not much follow-up. We here in the European Parliament, we've asked our legal service to see whether such disembarkation platforms would be legally possible in the European Union, and we got the reply that yes, of course, there needs to be checks and balances. You need to apply the acquis and your international treaties, but you can do this. And why is it important? Because exactly for the reason I mentioned before. Ideally, you would like to prevent refugees and migrants to embark on a dangerous journey across the Mediterranean that many have to pay the ultimate price for because people die. If you can make sure that we break the business model of smugglers by ending the sort of automaticity that getting onto a boat equalizes getting access to the European Union, but you create the chance that when you step on a boat on the southern side of the Mediterranean, that you could at the same day be back in a reception camp in the northern African territory, and there we do a screening, we do procedures, then this would really break the business model of smugglers. So yes, this idea needs to be revived. It's legally possible. It is an innovative way to think about policy, but it's something different, and that I also like to underline. It's something different than fully externalizing the EU asylum policy. This mainly goes for people who are rescued at sea, that we don't, if they're rescued close to northern African shores, we don't bring them all the way to the European Union to have their asylum procedures here, but we do it at the closest possible area in potentially northern Africa. So yes, I share that idea of Manfred Weber, and it's also a point in our discussion paper, our position paper of the EPP Group.
On this point that you just mentioned, this is a very old idea. In fact, I mean, I recall that in 2018 it was already brought forward by Sebastian Kurz and others, and he completely failed. I mean, he promised to create disembarkation platforms, and during the Austrian presidency, he did not find one single country on the other side of the Med that was willing to host refugees. So it's nice if you revive an idea, but how to make it work? What would be different now? Do you know any country that would be willing, or that has changed its mind since 2018? The second question, last week Commissioner Johansson said that if you want to fund defense, you need to take the money from other spending priorities, so it wouldn't be available twice, obviously. So what's your proposition? Which are the areas where money should be saved in order to move it to the construction of physical infrastructure at the border?
Thank you very much. Both are very relevant questions, and I in my introduction I referred to the ideas about regional disembarkation platforms from 2018, and my feeling is truly that there hasn't really been an effort to make this into a reality. It might be that Sebastian Kurz made some efforts, but institutionally from the European Union, this has never been followed up as a potential policy. The Commission clearly was not too keen on it because they saw all sorts of difficulties, mainly political, within the European Commission and also in the member states. Yes, we had council conclusions where they requested the idea to be investigated, but nothing much came of it. And I think the big difference also between 2018 and 2023, which we are now, is that if you look at the numbers arriving at our shores, the urgency and the need to think a bit more creatively about how we can develop the European asylum policy of the future we cannot afford to just sideline such ideas. So I agree, it's not going to be an easy answer, but there are no easy answers when it comes to migration and asylum policy, and we need cooperation with third countries, and we need to present it in such a way that it's also interesting for third countries to cooperate with the European Union. This is also something that we hear a lot of talk about, also by Ms. Johansson, but not much actual policy on this. So I think if we can build proper partnerships with third countries, we can make this work, because in the end, this is also about not wasting human lives at sea, which is a responsibility for the European Union as much as those countries in Northern Africa to tackle jointly. On the funding, of course, we have a European budget, and things cost money, and what you spend in one area cannot be spent in another area. But we have funds in the European Union available with billions of euros in it, whether it's the Asylum and Migration Fund, whether it's the Internal Security Fund. All these funds are perfectly eligible for spending also on these kind of issues. And in the end, it is up to the member states together with the Commission to also identify what the priorities are. And if 12 member states, and maybe by the time more, highlight it as a priority to spend money on border infrastructure, if Commission President von der Leyen says some of these borders are a priority for the European Union, then we also need to treat it as a priority with the funding that is available and which should be sufficient.
That's very interesting. May I just ask, so what you're suggesting is, for instance, that the Commission takes away money that is now dedicated to the fight against organized crime and builds fences instead? Because you specifically...
I mentioned
internal security.
I mentioned too, but internal security is a broad fund. I also mentioned the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. So there are plenty of options where you could find the money to do so. But the key issue, first and foremost, is that if we together decide that it is a priority to protect the borders, also including through infrastructure, then the argument, yes, but then we might not be able to spend it on some integration measures that we also like to do, that for me is not very valid. If we see it as a priority, we also need to address it as a priority also in our funding.
Just going back very quickly on the regional disembarkation platform, I honestly thought that was a dead and gone idea. So I'm trying to understand here. So, I mean, you can hardly put the failure on the EU institutions or, you know, the lack of their willingness to push this forward, but rather on the lack of willingness from the third countries to take part in this. And why? Well, it's because they need guarantees in a way. So are you advocating, for instance, that to make it mandatory for all EU member states to take in candidates that do have a right to asylum, for instance? I mean, to give guarantees to the third countries that they will not all remain on their territory. And just another question on the code of conduct. You were saying that NGOs don't need to do the work of patrolling, you know, the maritime borders of the EU, but like, what should we do then? I mean, would you suggest, I don't know, like a Mare Nostrum-like European mission to keep saving lives? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, of course, these are all not individual policies. It all needs to be part of one holistic approach. And I do think, if you look back in the past 5 years, that the idea of regional disembarkation platforms has not been sufficiently followed through at the European level, because some people in the European Commission apparently do not see the value of it. And I think what you said is absolutely correct. The idea of regional disembarkation platform is not to just keep everyone in Africa and allow nobody into the European Union. The problem we have now is that I think most of the member states would prefer to have a European asylum system where you actually would be able to get the most vulnerable people from the region that are being received in the region to the European Union. And what happens is the opposite. What happens now is, through the system we have today, with people arriving on boats or across the Turkish-Greek border at the Evros, it is not the most vulnerable people that arrive at the European Union. It is those that are fit enough, that have sufficient means to actually make that journey. I mean, if you look at the 2022 figures, out of the 330,000 people that illegally crossed our borders, 9 out of 10 were men. So not even 10% were actually women. Is this because women are so much less vulnerable than men? I don't think so. So yes, the idea would be that you would be able to take the most vulnerable people, the people actually in need of international protection, to the European Union. But I also understand that member states, in the situation we have today, when 330,000 people cross your border illegally, that it makes it very difficult, both politically and from an organizational perspective, to also be very warmly welcoming thousands of people through, for instance, resettlement. And this is something that you could solve by having regional disembarkation platforms. So you can make that sort of screening already before people embark on dangerous journeys, and then you could have ways with legal pathways for those who are really in need of international protection to also find that protection in the European Union, because there is nobody within the whole of the EPP that will say that the European Union should have no role whatsoever in receiving and protecting refugees from our Christian heritage. It's a duty for us to take care of people in need, but not in the way that it is currently happening. And the second question was on the code of conduct. You know, and this is very much related to the first point. We have seen in the past 9 years, we have seen Mare Nostrum, we have seen then the European Union, the Poseidon mission. We've had a maritime military presence. We've had the NGOs present throughout the times. And in all these situations, we had never had a situation where all people that got into trouble on the Mediterranean Sea could actually be saved. And this is one of the other reasons why it is so important to change this system. And what we cannot have is a situation where the maritime borders, and not even the maritime borders, it's often the maritime borders of northern African states, are patrolled by NGOs. That creates a mechanism that people are always transferred to the European Union. So it needs to be in line with the general policy of the European Union on asylum and migration, and therefore we need a code of conduct that clearly stipulates what those rules and regulations are. And there is work ongoing on this, and we look very much forward to the result of this, so we can work together with civil society organizations in order to make sure that we create a system where people are saved when they are in trouble on the sea, but at the same time we don't create a mechanism that in the end benefits mainly criminal gangs, people smugglers, and those people that are not really in need of international protection.
The question was referring to your statement that states should be held to do what they deem necessary. And I was asking if that includes some sort of leeway in whether and how to respect human rights, whether or not to make pushbacks or the length of the processing of applications. The second question is whether you define the Green Line in Cyprus as a place where the EU should be funding fences, despite the fact that it is not an external border of the EU. Thanks.
Thank you. On the first part, of course, I referred to the protection of the external borders. it is not the idea to give more leeway or anything to member states. I think in the asylum regulations that we have at the European Union, when it comes to the length of asylum applications, etc., there are rules, and in the case of crisis, there is already the possibility for member states to extend the deadlines. And of course, you need to prove that there is a crisis, but then there is the possibility to take more time when you are in a crisis. And I think that is fair. And we have also seen that, of course, in the case of the eastern external borders, when we faced the instrumentalization attempts by Lukashenko in Belarus, that even if within the current legislative framework the flexibility is not high enough to cope with a certain crisis, there is always the possibility for the European Council on the basis of the treaty to have specific measures for specific situations. So that was not what my call was for, and it goes without saying, and this is also something you will find throughout our position paper, that any action undertaken by member states or the European Union as a whole, or by an agency like Frontex or the EU Asylum Agency, needs to be in line with fundamental rights, needs to be in line with the EU acquis, and it needs to respect the principles of non-refoulement, etc. So that goes without saying. We see in Cyprus that with the Green Line, it is used also to create illegal migration flows to the European Union and to the territory of Cyprus. It's something we address also in the position paper, because in a way, if you look at Cyprus, I believe per capita they have the most asylum applications per capita of the whole of the European Union. So we talk a lot about some countries where there is large inflows of people, but we must not forget about a country like Cyprus, who, even though the numbers in absolute terms are maybe not as big as for Italy and Greece, per capita they face the largest inflow of the European Union. And the European Union needs to show solidarity with Cyprus and help the Cypriot government in coping with this in a way they deem most efficient. And of course, the Green Line is a very specific kind of border. There is a lot of political sensitivity around it. So there I would also really take the guidance of the Cypriot government. But should they need European help to cope with that situation, the European Union must be there to help them also financially.
Have you discussed this topic regarding setting up the wall on the Croatian-Bosnian border, perhaps?
We have not, like I said, that we have not discussed specific borders. The main point and the main call from our parliamentary group is that if member states feel that the best way to protect the external borders of the European Union, whether this is in Lithuania, Croatia, Greece, or wherever, the option must be there for the European Union to help fund this. Of course, if member states feel that there are better alternatives available to protect the external border, we will not force member states to build infrastructure where they don't want it. But should a government, whether this is the Croatian or the Lithuanian government, want to use physical border infrastructure to help us protect the external border, then the European Union needs to be there to help them.
My question is, you've talked about a lot about the percentages on the a lot of on external borders and trying to avoid people coming in. But what happens with people who are already in? There are several countries that are saying we need to distribute better the people that come in. There was this in the summer this announcement that the solidarity pack would start, but since then we haven't heard much about that. Will you also be promoting, or is there some discussion on how to better distribute? There are countries like Belgium or in France that say they have not capacity to keep everybody.
Yeah. No, of course, the solidarity within the European Union is an important part of the new pact. and within the different legislative files of the new pact, there will be a lot of emphasis on how this solidarity should work, because I think everybody can see that the solidarity within the European Union in the past 9 years has not been sufficient. I remember very well in 2015 and 2016, we had the first relocation decisions to accept asylum seeker and migrants from Greece and Italy in the rest of the European Union, which was only moderately successful. Now, I see, for instance, when it comes to Italy, 100,000 people in 2022 crossed the border to Italy. Many countries, including countries like France and Germany, offered to take over 7,000 people from Italy, and we are now half year into this period, and France and Germany in totally took over 202 people from Italy. So this is not what European solidarity should be about, and I would also really call on governments of countries like Germany and France who are never hesitating to sort of morally appeal to countries about solidarity to also show that in practice. What the EPP position paper on solidarity clearly states is that solidarity should be mandatory, but solidarity is more than only relocation. Solidarity is also about sharing human resources to make sure human resources can be operational in other countries than your own. It's also about financially helping other member states that need help. It could be in the shape of helping create border infrastructure where it's necessary. So solidarity, mandatory, there must be a solidarity mechanism, but it encompasses more than only the question of relocation. Also because we've seen in the past 9 years that the issue of relocation is something that completely blocks the discussions between the member states, and we really need to adopt this legislation to make sure that our asylum policy is future-proof. And in a way, just from a practical point of view, I would love to see all member states of the European Union helping each other in solidarity, but we can also realize that if this is not on the basis of a voluntary nature, it will never work in practice. So solidarity, mandatory, but the ways in which you can be solidarity, there is room for flexibility, as long as, and this is I think the crucial underlying point, as long as sort of the accumulation of voluntary solidarity of the individual member states is actually sufficient to solve the issue for the member state that is under pressure, because otherwise it will not work. We had the situation in 2015 that member states were all saying everything needs to be voluntary. I understand that. But then as member states, you have to make sure that what you do together in a voluntary nature is enough to solve the issue and to help the member state that is under pressure.
When you take the code of conduct that has been presented by the Italian government, are there specific points where you would differ from what they have declared as mandatory now for search and rescue operations?
Well, I mean, we need a European code of conduct, not an Italian one. I think that's the first idea. And we know that the search and rescue contact group, or whatever the official name is, will get together to discuss this code of conduct. And I'm sure there will be elements of the Italian code of conduct in there. And I also see the Italian code of conduct in that way as a call to other countries to actually help Italy. Like I mentioned, there were promises made to Italy to relocate 7,000 people. So far, they've had 200. I can really understand Italy saying, if this is the way you show your solidarity to us, then we need to take maybe some drastic measures. And I think if we could have, on the one hand, a clear path to an adoption of the pact that would actually help also the member states in Southern Europe, and we can have better agreements not only on paper, because solidarity on paper is easy, but also in practice, then I'm sure we can also find a code of conduct within the European Union on how to do this with NGOs. That also includes Italy.
But are these Italian regulations in line with the acquis and international humanitarian law?
But this is, with all due respect, I can do many things, but to pronounce myself on the legal issues and whether they are in line with the acquis is not up to me. For me, I really see it as a response of Italy to the lack of cooperation felt by other member states. And I think that this is as much a responsibility of countries like Germany and France as it is of Italy.